And I do know we had the housing strategy as part of this. We had the Justice Council as part of this. We had the Technology Council as part of this. Had climate change and environment, but I think, I'm looking around the room and I think you're all hanging in by tether hooks. So I'm just checking in with you if you are willing, what is your desire of the room at this time? If we're ready to. Microphone 18, please.
Yeah, thank you. And I think because the election's over and I think we forgot one part of it at the end of the election. I think there's supposed to be a motion to destroy the ballots, and I don't think that happened, unless there's something in the Societies Act that says different.
We'll double check with the electoral officer at this point in time. We're kind of caught up in other areas of the voting, so we'll just double check on that. Thank you for that question, and it is held for 30 days in case there is a challenge on any of these. So thank you very much for that clarity. Again, I'm turning to you to see what is the, I'm sorry, Chief Spahan, I forgot what number you're at. You're blocking it actually with your cup. 16, thank you. 16, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a point of order. I just wanted clarity on the agenda and why the fisheries presentation was not allowed. I think we should be following the agenda, and that should have been done. As you heard one of the elders say, it's a very important natural resource that we need to speak to. And I have questions regarding salmon.
And pardon me, you are right, that was on the agenda. And I'm checking in here right now with you at the will, so we can go back to that one. That was the next item on the agenda. What happened was we pushed up the resolutions, and that was the will of the room. And then we're going back to our agenda items, and I'm checking in with you again, literally about these items, what I hear you saying, and what was stated by Cliff Atleo Sr. is the importance of that, and if they still wish to speak, and if they're still here, we certainly welcome them, as they are the next item on the agenda. That would be Chief Dalton Silver, Jordan Point, and Cliff Atleo Sr. Are they still present? Come on down, the price is right. Sure. You don't have to stand, you can sit and do your presentation from either side. You did say that you were going to make it brief, and we did continue. Yeah. No, I don't mean pressure. I just mean that you had indicated that you were. So are you using this PowerPoint? It's up to you.
Probably not. That would probably really take too long.
Okay. So would you like to be here, or would you like to be there? It's as you wish.
Can I? Like, it doesn't have to be up there.
It's as you wish, wherever you are most comfortable.
Okay. Thanks, Russell, and apologies for the floor. My colleagues have vacated, but, and Jordan had the PowerPoint. But as Cliff was saying, it's when Wicked Inter spoke, it's really difficult to get fisheries on the agenda at a lot of our big assemblies, and it's very important to all our people. I mentioned earlier we've constantly sought audience with Minister LeBlanc on a lot of issues, and I think along the lines of what the Justice Minister, what Jody was talking about today, goes along in line of the thoughts of the AFN Fish Committee. And in representing as one of the political reps for BC, I do my best to collaborate and to get input from the various fisher groups around the province. I sit as a delegate with the Lower Fraser Fisheries Alliance, but also with the Fraser River Aboriginal Fisheries Secretariat, and with the Fraser Fraser Salmon Council. But I think as far as BC goes, we have a stronger collaboration here around fisheries issues. With the Fraser River Aboriginal Fisheries Secretariat, there's a delegation from Vancouver Island, right from Newchonlith, right up to the area where our new regional chief is from. Actually, I've sat in an assembly there at Takla Landing and heard about the lack of fish coming back to the spawning grounds. But as far as the fishery go, we have had meetings with Minister LeBlanc, and I was given the task of representing our committee at Whitehorse and asked to bring up a lot of the issues of national concern on the fishery. And one of the main things is priority access is not being met. We relayed to Minister LeBlanc the fact that we meet with Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and in their post-season reports, they're always saying that their management decisions were largely based on current case law. And I informed Minister LeBlanc that as far as BC is concerned, that's a false statement. The issues around Sparrow decision and others it's not being implemented in BC. And at the national level, one of the things that was really surprising to some of us was the co-governance that's being displayed in Ontario around their fisheries. The First Nations, Indigenous groups are issuing their own licenses. And the people across the country were appalled when they heard that in BC here, we have to put out to the government for a license to conduct a ceremonial fishery. The management decisions here in BC are such that they're trying their best to divide us, but I was talking with Jordan and with Cliff earlier, and from the Lower Fraser we have MOUs with the Fraser Salmon Management Council, Fraser River Aboriginal Fisheries Secretariat, with other groups as Okanagan Alliance, Sequetman Fisheries, Upper Fraser Fisheries Conservation Alliance, and IMOG on the island, and other groups were all committed to working together. It was brought up at the national level how much BC is collaborating on this issue that's of importance to us. It was mentioned, I think, yesterday in some of the deliberations about health issues, and that's one of the things we brought up with the minister, was that the access to our traditional foods is very important to the health and well-being of our people. I let them know that in my area there were remains of one of our ancestors. We allowed tests to be done 2,500 years ago. 85% of this person's diet was fish. And that points to some of the health problems that our people are facing. Lack of access to our traditional foods. The onslaught of diabetes amongst our people is such that it's at epidemic proportions, whereas we've never had that before. And medical experts will point to the lack of access we have to our traditional foods. And that's going on right across the country. But one of the steps that we'd like to see is an implementation of the Supreme Court decisions from back east, Marshall, from here, Sparrow, and others that are not being implemented on the ground here. And I mentioned the people in Ontario, Nipissing for one, are regarded as leaders as far as managing their fisheries, and actually they've moved more into co-governance than co-management. They monitor their own fisheries, they issue their own licenses, and they informed us that they did that under Sparrow. And they were really surprised that the Sparrow decision is not being implemented here in BC. And I think, you know, what the Justice Minister is saying is that those decisions and our rights have to be recognized, has to be implemented on the ground in our deliberations with the federal government. And I brought that up with Minister LeBlanc, that we do need to talk about our rightful place in looking after our resources would be co-governance. And that's along the lines of what they're talking in government-to-government relations, nation-to-nation relations. Another area of concern is the fish farms. In the east, with some of the Mi'kmaq nations, they're actively involved in the open net farming for the economic values. But in those areas, they've seen the downfall also of the wild stocks. And it was brought up by myself with the minister that that's a very contentious issue here in BC. Whereas there are some people maybe benefiting economically, but one of the things of biggest concern to all of us in BC is the wild stocks, and we can never forget those. But I just want to say that we do need to continue the fight for the access. The priority is not being met in some areas, well, probably in all areas of our province and right across the country. The sports sector is getting priority. And the monitoring on the sports fishery is next to nil. And I don't know about the other groups around BC, but I know with the First Nations fishery, our pieces of fish are counted. Every piece that we catch is counted and reported to Fisheries and Oceans. It's not a level playing field there. We've also brought up that there's not a day, I think, that goes by that our rights are not being infringed by the actions of the governments, especially around fisheries and natural resources. We expressed the need to be a little stronger in our deliberations with the government and really pushing the envelope of nation to nation, government to government. But I didn't want to take up a whole bunch of time here, but I just want to relay the importance of the fishery to all of our people and the access we need to those, and the importance of the habitat, the other activities that are occurring in our territories. We're trying to move to a multi-organizational dialogue session with energy and mines, with natural resources, with the Ministry of Environment, to sit down and talk, as a lot of their activities have an effect on fish habitat and on our way of life, which is contradictory to the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as the government has committed to implement. And I think, you know, in many areas we need to push that envelope. So I'll just shorten it up and thank the chair for the time, and thank Chief Spahan for getting me up here. Thank you.
There's a question or a comment. John.
Any? Oh.
Yeah. So, no, microphone 23, please.
Okay.
Thank you, Dalton, stepping up in the last minute. And thank you, Lisa Behan, Chief, for bringing this up. I appreciate what you presented. The word that I heard, and this is what I've been messaging for a while, is we're focused on access. We, I believe, need to focus on protection and rehabilitation. If we allow the government to continue with the mismanagement and the focus on supporting industries that are having a very dire and direct impact on our salmon, by their actions they're creating and hollowing our Section 35(1) rights. And I believe that it's time that we have a wild salmon summit. And I've talked with Jordan about this, and I just want to flag it for everyone and suggest that we bring our best minds together and understand, so we can understand what all the good work that's going on by all the organizations that Chief Silver has mentioned, and we can understand their strategies and their priorities, and then we can fill the gaps and come up with a comprehensive strategy to protect and rehabilitate our salmon stocks. Because I really believe, and I know that in our territory, in one of our rivers, we had about 100 to 200 pinks come back. That's it. And this is happening too often in too many places. And so I really do want us all to look as ways to make this happen. So we have a wild salmon dialogue, a very clear, concise, and direct message, because we have the wild salmon policy that's coming out. It's being consulted this month. We've got the Fisheries Act that's going to be finalized. These are opportunities I think we need to collectively capitalize on. And in closing, I just want to reiterate to everyone the invitation for one of our hereditary chiefs of the Tla'awitzis First Nation. There is as many of you know, there's an occupation that's been occurring on fish farms in our traditional territories. And on Saturday, there is a gathering and invitation to First Nations to come and demonstrate support. And so I know that it's from noon till 4, so we get to Port McNeill. Oh, let me correct that. Beautiful Port McNeill. Somewhere in the morning, you go down near the water and you'll see a bunch of us standing around with water taxis to get you in. Thank you.
Microphone number 16, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Lee Spahan, Chief of the Co-Water Band. Thank you for your presentation, Dalton. I think for the next meeting, I think there needs to be a longer time period for fisheries, as it is very important for all people. This year, I had to purchase some sockeye for elders to lay off of the fish coming back to our rivers. And again, 8 bands within our nation are purchasing 10,000 sockeye from Alaska just to feed our people. Conservation, the impacts, the logging. I took a trip from Merritt to Coquihalla to check out the water. I counted less than 6 fish in the Coldwater River. I just received an email about an hour ago regarding the Thompson River steelhead. The forecast for those steelhead returning is estimated at 133. Yet the province still has an opening for recreation fishery. That's an infringement on the rights of all our people, especially when we're trying to conserve them. I've been telling DFO for 7 years, they don't know how to manage fish. There needs to be a clear mandate that goes back to Ottawa to tell them they better start listening to us. At the UBCIC, I mentioned that we need to start taking action. That needs to happen. The occupation, those fish farms is happening. We need to support our brothers and sisters there. Chief Bob was talking about how we look after our rivers. I've been bringing it up with DFO on how we need to look after them and how they used to fund that, but they don't do that anymore. Because the last time they did that in the Coldwater River was in 1985. So I have lots of great concerns for our salmon. So I needed to mention that. Cookstam, thank you.
Thank you. We'll proceed to microphone number 7, please.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Klako Gela, Consulate Chief Sramuwachit Muchlet. My English name is Jerry Jack, and I asked a question at home at our fisheries meeting, was my dad's fishing case in vain? Because it seems like we have to fight to get fish when he went to the Supreme Court of Canada and won his case, you know, for fishing in our territories. You know, and at our last meeting, and I was saying that when he got pinched, he was fishing for my and my late wife's wedding, and that's how that fishing case started. And it really frustrates me when I hear everybody talking about their struggles to get food fish when it shouldn't be, when there's these cases that have gone to court and we've won. I don't understand. I'm trying to understand why there's an issue on getting ceremonial fish for our people and feeding our people, because we've won that right. You know, I just had to bring that up. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief, and thanks, Owadi, Bob. Important thing is the habitat, and I mentioned earlier that, you know, that there are initiatives being taken. At home, we're actively working on rehabilitating some of the spawning streams. And I mentioned I was at Takla before, and I think that was maybe 10 years ago. And some of the counts there counted about 12 and 25 sockeye coming back into the spawning streams there. And those we count down here as the early runs, the sockeye that we all pull out of the water. We won't fish when they're coming through in consideration of the brothers and sisters upriver. But it's very important. I think, you know, we mentioned the Fisheries Act, Navigational Protection Act. Those are some of the concerns we raised in submissions there, that the government is lessening the protection of fish habitat. And we want to see more protection of fish habitat. But as you mentioned too, the rehabilitation of some of these places, rebuilding some of these spawning places. I've seen some of the work done by the Secwepemc and the Okanagan Alliance in bringing salmon back into some of the streams that they're working on up there, and it works. We did a stream in our area about 20 years ago, and coho came back. And you mentioned wild salmon. I think every single one of our groups that we sit with, the main concern is wild fish, the wild stocks. And that's what I mentioned to those that are working in aquaculture, is that we can never forget the wild stocks. I brought up what happened near Lummi Nation just recently with the escapement of Atlantic salmon. And who knows what will happen with the wild stocks as they come in to the different systems. And I thank the Chief, Jerry Jack, for what you're saying, is that it's what we're talking about at the national level, is the Supreme Court decisions made here in BC are being implemented a lot more strongly in other provinces than here. And as I mentioned, they can't believe it, right from Northwest Territories to Ontario, that we have to apply for a ceremonial license. One of our chiefs was here earlier. He's actively in a court case right now for going out and catching one spring salmon to do something very important that we try and maintain for our people, the first salmon ceremony. He's going to court still for that. And that's, to a lot of us, I think that's a crime in itself when our people are facing charges over something like that. It's definitely an infringement on our rights, and as some people said from other parts of the country, that it's a harassment, that they'll continually take our people and charge them for offenses that are no offense. As we're concerned, it's an inherent right that he was practicing. Thanks.
So I saw two more hands go, I saw a hand previously, and another hand just go up. So microphone number 14, please, and then we'll go over to 18.
Byron Lewis, Chief of the Okanagan Band. I think one of the things also what needs to be concentrated on, especially by the First Nations Fisheries Council, is looking at SARA implementation. And the reason why I bring this up is because we all, you know, a lot of people around the table heard me speak about, you know, saying that the extinction of a species equals the extinguishment of a right. And, you know, what we need to also do is start looking at how we're going to quantify and qualify what exactly is Aboriginal right, or right. And one is the significance, or the quantification is the importance. Well, the qualification is what's a measure of importance. Quantification is what is a monetary value. And if you look at salmon, even today, 2 years ago, the retail value of salmon was $8.99 a pound. And you take in consideration, I think at one study I had seen that former streams and rivers on the west coast of British Columbia, there's something like 40% no longer support salmon in viable numbers. But when you're talking about that, even, you know, that's significant losses. And if INAC is going, I mean, if DFO is going to let those streams go and not bring those back, well, maybe they should be brought up to speed and told, well, I guess you're ready to start talking about the extinguishment of a right and the infringement and the cost of that loss. And, you know, if we start doing this right, they're not going to, just on one single stream alone, is going to amount in the tens of millions of dollars, if not in the hundreds of millions, if it's calculated property, taking into example your food, your social, and your ceremonial. You just talked about an instance down here where, you know, they had to purchase their food fish. You know, this is supposed to be guaranteed to us. You know, and ceremonial purposes, that's another view. If we're having a feast for a death in our communities, or if we're giving gifts sometimes, you know, those are all ceremonial uses. And the transfer of traditional knowledge cannot happen if you do not have salmon in those streams. And you mentioned us in some of the, you know, and one of the things I'd like to say is, you know, for my age group, who I am, and I'm 55 now, we never did have a practice of actually actively fishing on the salmon that come back up in the Okanagan. We came up to our elders and we had these coolers full of salmon finally, and God, we're so proud of the fact that we're able to deliver them salmon. We flipped open the lid and they're looking at them, and the first thing they said, well, they're not bled. I said, then we're all, what? And they said, yeah, they're not bled. Then they, you know, then they explained to us, if you don't bleed them, then it taints the meat and has a taste. But how would we ever know that? Because we never had a chance to practice those on that continuation of that practice or that right, from kids up to adults and down to our kids again. That's how important this is, and this is where we need to really understand that that Species at Risk Act goes along a lot further and just basically, curtailing rights or taking rights, you know, what some people perceive that taking rights away. No, it's actually puts government on notice that they basically hit that threshold, that they are on the verge of extinguishing a right, and there is dire consequences that are going to cost them hundreds of millions of dollars. But we need to get to the point to where we can actually conduct socioeconomic analysis that's going to determine that. And you go up and down the coast here on, well, you even go over here. Look how many of the streams in Vancouver that that were historically had coho in there. You know, now there's only one or two. And you go further upstream, it's the same thing. Each time there's an identifiable loss that's measurable and it's calculable, and that's why they wouldn't do that with the Cultus Lake sockeye, and they gave you that piece of, well, I won't say it, but, on that Glasticin, socioeconomic analysis. And the most recent one they had was a piece of garbage. You know, so we need to get there, and I hope that Fisheries Council, the First Nations Fisheries Council, starts moving in that direction. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Microphone number 18, please.
Thank you. Keith Tate from the Niska village of Gidlachnamik, formerly known as New Ants. I really appreciate the discussion around salmon. I say that because I've been around long enough to see the impacts of not bringing this to a higher profile. The leaders that can do that should be here, listening to the discussion. I've been around long enough to see that every time there's an important assembly such as this, by the time fisheries comes onto the agenda, about 40% of the participants are here. And so it doesn't get the same kind of attention that it needs to get, so that we can get federal government, Federal Fisheries Bureau to realize, the importance of maintaining stocks to maintain people's heritage and livelihood. Far too often it's industry that dictates how we behave on our own land and how we treat each other. I used to hear the late James Gosnell and all of these colleagues talk about the need for us to start being proactive in taking care of what maintains our health and our livelihood. Today, I'm still hearing that same message. When the last NDP government was in power way back in the 90s, 97, I worked in the what they call the Water Restoration Program. And it was only because back then the Nisga'a Tribal Council had forced the two levels of government to give some consideration to rehabilitating the damages that logging did in our territory. And so we were able to do that. I was really appreciative of that. And back then, I think one stream cost $500,000 just to restock and rehabilitate the grounds. And so I've been in and around that area of concern all my life. I was once a logger. I ran machines through those creeks, and I ended up rehabilitating them. Up in our area, the Nass River was the only river that was a viable option for fishing, commercial or otherwise. What that does to that river, it has a lot of impact in that everybody from around the rest of the province converges in that area. And so that forces us to start applying regulations that we did not want to apply to our own people, and start determining for them how much they actually need to sustain them through the winter. And we see the runs coming at various degrees and at various timelines. Like this year, we've seen 3 different runs come all at once. The Chinook, the Sockeye, and Coho. We're catching them all in the same net. It was highly unusual. I think when we're talking about the Fisheries Council, I attended one meeting, and one only. And I witnessed on how the federal government treats that group. They don't send anybody of any significance that can make any moves towards being proactive. They listen, okay, duly noted, blah, blah, blah. That's why I'm saying, Madam Chair, we need the highest profile leadership here to be able to carry this message forward for us. before we start being reactive. I hate to see the day when I can't have a smoked salmon in the wintertime. I hate to see the day when we can't teach our grandchildren about the salmon that sustains them. We're fish people. When you take that part of our identity away, what's next? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much, and we would like to speak again. We were looking to get to the next item on our agenda. Microphone 16, please.
Thank you for allowing me to get the last question in. This is so important, and listening to the last speaker and how our chiefs of our nation are trying to meet with the Minister LeBlanc, which goes on deaf ears. And would it be possible to put a motion on the floor to direct the regional chief to talk to Minister LeBlanc to let them know that we need to meet with him and talk about fisheries? Because every time we meet with DFO, they consider it consultation, but yet when you sit across from the table from anybody, they don't have no level of authority. That was one of the questions that we brought up as the Nicathlum when we met in Kamloops with DFO. We're tired of beating around the bush and meeting with DFO officials who don't have no authority when it comes time to talk about infringement on our rights and the protection of our salmon within our rivers. So I'd like to recommend that, to have that motion put on the floor.
The window for late resolutions was closed earlier today, or yesterday, I'm sorry. It was closed. I can tell you that right now. We do have two resolutions that were passed today on specific areas going to the ministry. And I also wanted to bring to your attention for further dialogue on an area dedicated to this. And Chief Dalton wanted to ensure that you knew that you were very encouraged to attend, and that is the First Nations Fishery Council British Columbia Annual General Assembly. It's happening on the 7th and 8th of November of 2017. What I do hear very clear, and I will ensure that, and I'm sure the staff have noted here, is that fisheries. Thank you very much, Chief Spahan. But fisheries needs to be, it was stated by many here, fishery needs to be higher up on the agenda, and certainly you're also looking for officials in a greater capacity coming to this. So at that, I'm going to thank our one Chief Dalton Silver for stepping forward and participating and presenting as best as he could. I want to thank you for a very fulsome discussion. Again, I know there's a disappointment. We always run into this issue. Day 2 of Assembly, it empties out. You certainly here have decided to stay, and I thank you for that, for you to attend to each other's discussion and dialogue and learning and exchanging. And all I can do is encourage you to say the same to your chiefs who you saw and witnessed leave, that they may have the same commitment to stay all the way through. We're always going to run into the same issue. Because if we back it up to a day and a half, then people are going to only come for a day. It's just one of those things that I know as a chairperson that happens on the regular. All we can do is encourage people and implore people to participate. So thank you so very much, Chief Dalton, for coming forward.
Thank you.
And thank you, everyone, for your patience. We do have a number of people still in attendance who want to provide some updates to you. As we have had some people who have waived their right to speak. And one suggestion I may have is for those areas that we did not hear from in this assembly, that be pushed as a priority to be on the top of the agenda in the next assembly. That would be a suggestion I would make and the capacity as a chair, that would happen for the next one. Those things that got missed get pushed forward onto the next assembly. So going along with our agenda, we do have still present with us, and I thank you for your patience. We have we have Grand Chief Ed John, we have Byron Lewis, and we have Paul Blum, the advisor, First Nations Energy and Mining Council, to provide an update on climate change and environment. We also still have with us, and I thank you for your patience, Estelle White, who is the BCAFN representative on the BC Aboriginal Justice Council, who both would like to provide an update. I don't know if we have anyone here from the housing strategy, but we do. I would turn to Paul and Ed, Grand Chief Ed John, or sure. So we'll call Paul forward as to provide an update on the climate change and environment. Yes. So we're going to go over to microphone number 2. Oh, 24, then 2.
Thank you. I really don't have anything to add on the climate change. There's a resolution that I'm aware of, Maureen, that the executive passed to put the climate change discussions with Canada at the AFN on hold or on pause. I just became aware of that today. What I needed to say on climate change, I said earlier today on the proposal for the $200 million ask to help. The wildfires are directly as a result of climate change. So we need money for adaptation and for mitigation measures and planning for First Nations communities. I'm going to leave it at that because you have that document in front of you. So I'm going to leave. Turn over to Paul. His report's going to be shorter than mine.
Thank you. So microphone 2, please.
Thank you very much. I'd like to acknowledge the Musqueam First Nation on whose territory we're speaking today. And I actually have some good news, I think. We've made a bit of progress on the environmental assessment front with British Columbia. I think in past assemblies at the Union and the summit meetings, I've said we've got a list of recommendations. Those recommendations had what we call a too hard pile. That issue, I think, with the new government, the new NDP government in British Columbia, has seen some reconsideration on their behalf. And I've got a few slides, and I think I won't get into a lot of detail because it's the end of the day, but just to let you know that the summit and the union passed resolutions that the recommendations that we had suggested earlier this year need to be put into legislation. And Dave Porter, our CEO, we met with the Associate Deputy Minister from the British Columbia Environmental Assessment Office on Tuesday, and he said that he has gone to Cabinet, his minister, and got approval to address a number of the outstanding issues, and I'll just run through a few of them here to be put into legislation. So number 1, making First Nations land use plans and stewardship plans legally enforceable. Number 2, developing a fee schedule to allow First Nations to be funded to fully participate in the EA process in BC, which includes First Nations-led reviews, that if First Nations want to undertake their own reviews like SSN and Squamish. 3, shared decision-making. 4, legal protection of sensitive economic, cultural, and spiritual information. 5, implementation of administrative monetary penalties, including exploring First Nations-led compliance and enforcement. And lastly, resolving the relationship between the timing of the environmental assessment process, the government-to-government negotiation process for the impacted First Nations, and impact benefit agreements between First Nations and proponents. A couple slides down here, we have a diagram that describes that. If you look on the far right, if you can see it, at the end of that it says First Nations decision. So here's the process that was described to us on Tuesday. The minister, the provincial minister, I'm talking about the provincial process, that minister would like to see legislation in about a year from now. First, he would like to identify the topics that should be legislated in engagement with First Nations over the next 2 to 3 months. Then the minister will identify a public minister's advisory council to have public consultation with unions, with environmental groups, with industry. First Nations will also sit on that, but in the first 3 months is the critical time period, and then moving through the spring and possibly the fall to legislate a new EA in BC. Federally, we had an assessment process with the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency last week. As many of you know, they're moving toward legislation federally. That process will start in January. And we have 60 First Nations in BC have put in submissions. And one of the consensus recommendations that First Nations should be involved in the legislative process itself. We have not heard back from Ottawa at this point if they're going to allow First Nations participation in that process, but the minister says it's probably a year-long process starting in January. So that's the federal and the provincial EA updates. Thank you.
Microphone 20.
So I really just want to close on this. I want to thank Dalton earlier for the discussions on fisheries, and Bobby Chamberlain for talking about not access but the environment protection. And I want to give you an example in the territory I come from. You take this river out here. I'm at the very top end of it, at the headwaters in the Skeena River, the headwaters of this river, Fraser, and the headwaters of the Mackenzie River in the Arctic. That's where my people live. The early Stewart sockeye this year was supposed to, it's the first run Fraser sockeye the first sockeye run in the Fraser River. And this year was supposed to be the bigger year. There were, I mean, if you can call 99,000 a big year, that was supposed to be the number. Live count in the summer at the end of the run, 7,400. It's about 15% of the brood year from 2013. 4 years ago. So it's just, and that's the early Stewart sockeye run. The late Stewart sockeye run, which runs with the early summers, that's just as dire. This year it was supposed to be higher again, and it's the worst, one of the worst years ever. And part of the problem is that, as Dalton raised, the issue of sport fishery in the river. And it continues to haunt. I mean, there's a priority in sparrow conservation and Aboriginal fishery and then sport and commercial, but for some strange reason, DFO never manages according to that order of priority. The early Stewart sockeye comes from 55 streams. 55 streams, so there's some, maybe there's 10 fish. Some of them couple hundred fish, and that's it. And that's what is the foundation of what's called the early Stewart sockeye. It's probably about 70, 80 miles of streams along the major waterways, like in the Middle River, Trembler Lake, Kakla Lake, where our new regional chief's from. One of the major problems we'll run into is this summer, for example, the waters were extremely warm. I was fishing down here with one of my sons at the mouth of the river. I wasn't fishing, he was. I went for the ride with him, and I was going to wash my hands, and I swear to God, the water was warm enough to take a bath in it. The water temperature was lethal to migrating salmon, and that's really part and parcel of the climate change we're talking about and the environmental assessments, and why it's so important for our voice to be heard at all places. And on SIA, the protection of watersheds, the protection of habitat, to be able to allow our communities to still access. So I share the same concerns that were expressed down at the other end of the table here around the extinguishment at the right. So just maybe, Madam Chair, thank you very much. I appreciate just adding to this, but tying in climate change into the picture.
Thank you very much, and thank you for accommodating us on this discussion. I'm just going to turn to, and he's already waving at me, so Chief Byron Lewis, who also was part of the panel on climate change and environment. So microphone 14, please.
Byron Lewis, Chief of the Okanagan Band. I'll just give a brief update on some of the work that's been going on in terms of the Advisory Committee on Climate Action and the Environment, or the ACCAE. It's co-chaired by Regional Chiefs Erasmus, Day, and Hart, and these had participated in the First Ministers meeting, leading to a jointly announced process document that's attached. I'll be handing over the briefing notes to the Assembly. And some of the other things that came out of there was Joint Committee on Action, on Climate Action. And it goes through, and the objectives of the JCCA are jointly develop real meaningful approaches for First Nations to position themselves as leader in climate action. And I'm going to provide the briefing notes, and they can be picked up tomorrow. But I think, you know, I just want to bring up points about, you know, what we'd actually talked about in the meeting that's of more relevance. And one of the points in there is when we look at climate change and what's been discussed around here earlier on about the changes in water and the temperature, those are actual real effects of what's happening to us today in terms of climate. When you have thermal blockages that's been happening on the Fraser River for the last decade, and the very fact that the province, even how many of us remember Siska Creek? And Siska Creek was it was a tributary of the Fraser River that Ainsworth Forest Company was going to log in the past. The thing about Siska Creek was a pristine watershed that retained its water temperature at a consistent level through the year. But what happened in there was with that logging, and you're taking away in each one of those streams that they logged like that were reservoirs for salmon as they made it up through the Fraser traditionally, and allowed for, you know, so they could go from one refuge to the other, and when its temperatures of water got to a certain point. And you look at climate change. Well, climate change is the fact of what we're seeing right now. These salmon are all dying from thermal blockage. And recently, you know, we talk about the success on the Okanagan River, but about a year ago, due to BC Hydro's management of the Columbia River, had actually stopped water flows and changed water flows on the Columbia. And the difference between Fraser and sockeye salmon are that Fraser can actually, you know, at 18 Celsius, it becomes lethal. In the Okanagan, it's 22 Celsius and salmon can still move through the system. But, you know, these changes, and these are all measurable changes, and we're talking about what Canada's response to this whole thing on climate change. They talk about, you know, curbing levels to, I think, what is it, 2002 levels? But the very fact, and one of the things we said right at the first time we sat down at that table is, it's not important. It's sure cutting back, you know, levels to 2002 are important, but we got to keep in mind that we're having effects to the environment prior to this. So what we talk about is how we're going to mitigate. And how are we going to mitigate some of these damages that are going to be happening to not only, you know, we talk about salmon, but also terrestrial species. And we don't have to go any further to look at mountain caribou, what's happening in the southern interior, or some of the other effects to other animals where you have global warming. So I think, you know, what we really need to do is how are we going to be pushing, you know, not only government and that, on how they're going to mitigate the impacts to what is basically our Aboriginal rights to it, whether it's a salmon or to resident stocks that are, you know, going under the same threat inland. And, I think these are some of the things that we really need to consider, and we really need to, come to grips on how are we going to mitigate these impacts that are going to happen. They're going to happen on, the Fraser. They're already happening. You look at all 4 species, all of them have been, are in decline. You look on the Columbia, it's the same thing. We got one healthy run, but we still have 3 others that are in dire straits. You look at all the other systems around BC, and when we look at the net worth of those species, we're talking literally hundreds of millions of dollars, and we should not be allowing them to get away with that. If we're going to save species, we got to make damn sure that it's more expensive to pay us out on the extinction of species than it is to recover those species and have them properly managed. And that's probably the only way we're ever going to succeed in, preventions and climate change. And we're going to have to look at innovations, and there is innovations that happened around this province that actually worked. But I'm going to leave it at that, and I think everybody's pretty tired, so I'm going to leave the briefing notes up at the front, and I hope you grab them, tomorrow. I'm going to see if we can get them printed off, and they'll be there for your review.
Thank you so much, Chief Byron. Microphone 24, please.
Thank you, Ken Watts, proxy for Echuclisset, and thanks for the presentation. Just really quickly, I wanted to say this earlier when we had the presentation about emergency response, and I'm glad Grand Chief Ed John mentioned it, thinking about our communities where some people didn't even mow their lawns this summer because it never grew because of the climate change that's happening in our territories. And also thinking about an article I just read about an Inuvik man who is now 100% sustainable house that's 26 solar panels on his house and a battery pack that powers his home. And I keep thinking about this Nuu-chah-nulth principle we have of Hishuk Sawak, which means everything is interconnected, and Uathak, which means taken care of. And we as First Nations always say we're stewards of the land and we're going to take care of it. And for me, I keep wondering when are we going to really take the lead on green energy in our own communities? I'm glad we talked about a housing strategy. Imagine a community that is not just run by green energy, whether it's micro hydro projects, but also use sustainable resources to build that house, uses solar panels to actually power that house. As we keep saying, we're looking after our territories, that, we all do our best we can, but let's work with our partners such as INAC and others to build green homes. Let's use energy efficient hybrid cars to power our communities, those community vehicles we use in our First Nations. So I keep thinking about this. Well, what is the solution? I really think that provincially we do need some type of strategy or action plan around climate change because it's so interconnected. You heard Byron go on about fisheries and the interconnection around that as well. But what can we do in our own homes, in our own communities to address climate change? And I think here in BC we should help lead the way in terms of that infrastructure in our communities coming with a green energy. But also, again, just in closing, when we met the Premier with the Cabinet the other week, we spoke about Site C and the project that was their movement towards Site C. But there's enough green energy projects in partnership with First Nations around this province that can give just as much power and create just as much jobs. So, again, I'd encourage this BCAFN and our Leadership Council to really look at a climate change action plan so that we can address it in all the areas such as housing, infrastructure, et cetera. So thank you. Chu.
Thank you. Microphone 16, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Lee Spahan, Chief of Coldwater Band. Climate change and the discussion that the 2 previous speakers were talking about and the impacts. As you know, the Coldwater River is low, but how Trans Mountain wanted to start work on the expansion of the pipeline up in my area and how much water they wanted to use. And climate change has a huge effect on that. Because they plan to use 200 truckloads of water, B-train, to do a borehole dig on the Coldwater River. and the work that they're doing on the Coquihalla River. And as you heard with the climate change and how DFO puts it, the less abundance of fish available for us. But it also puts pressure on the wildlife, because when there's not enough fish to go around, everybody goes hunting. But yet, as you see how the drought of the summer went on, especially with the wildfires, that brings all the game, the wildlife, down. They don't venture far from water, and it puts a lot of pressure on the wildlife. One of the things what we're trying to do is sit down at the table with Flinro to discuss the upcoming, what they said we need to talk about the hunting, the protocols, and that's very serious. One of my elders went out hunting about a week and a half ago. They found a moose that was shot dead. Nothing was taken. It was shot for sport. So that concerns our people up in our area, as there's a lack of moose in our respective territories, which is a huge concern. And I think we need to be vigilant about that. So climate change has a huge effect on everything. It's not only just fish, but yes, it concerns everything. So I needed to mention that. Cookstram, thank you.
Thank you, and I'm going to give the last word to microphone 19, and then we're going to move on to another topic.
Yes, thanks, Madam Chair. Andy Phillips, Scouts. I just wanted to concur with the comments around, I'd like to thank Delton and Bobby Chamberlain for being advocates for wild salmon. And we look at our EA processes, and we look at the provincial or federal EA processes. They don't work for us, and I'm kind of leery about. I appreciate the PowerPoint with the ministers trying to develop a new process beginning in January. It goes kind of back to what Jody was speaking about earlier about an opportunity here for us to be stewards of the land and incorporating our own traditional laws to our own EA processes, to our own Water Act, to our own forestry laws, to our own fishing laws, and to make sure that our principles are being adhered to in terms of our traditional laws. And so how do we move forward with blanket and a standardized indigenous approach to our EA processes, to our decision-making processes, so they're in line with our rights and title, and so we're not contradicting that by relying on the federal government to do that drafting for us. The work begins with us, and then we need to do that work. So those are just my comments. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and thank you for everybody for your participation on this. And thank you, Paul. I believe you rearranged flights to be able to stay and provide this update, and thank you as well both to Grand Chief Ed John and to Chief Byron for chiming in on your perspective on this abbreviated version of this discussion. We do have on our agenda still the BCAFN housing strategy. I do see Chief Dan George here still. If you wanted to just make some brief comments, I invite you to come forward. I also know I don't see Denise from the First Nations Technology Council here, nor do I see Tyrone McNeil, but I do see we do have the Estella White with the BCAFN, who is BCAFN representative to the BC Aboriginal Justice Council. So we're hoping to get some brief comments from both of them before it goes. So what microphone? I can't see everybody's putting their, by the way, you're all 21. Putting your coffee cups in front of the numbers. 21, thank you.
Chief Dan George, Chief of the Burnside Band. I'm doing a presentation next week at the summit, so I'll just keep it short and have a little discussion on what we're doing nationally. We're also doing a joint MC with INAC and CMHC to the federal government so that we can continue our negotiations with them on the national housing strategy. But next week I'll do my presentation at the summit, and I'm sure most of the chiefs will be there, same chiefs, so no use doubling it up. And I know everybody's had a long day here, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, and also I'm sure we appreciate, you did add a lot of discussion around the resolution as well, so it was touched on, maybe not exactly the way you had planned it out, but we appreciate you hanging in there as we got ourselves wrapped around, because I know there was an intention to present first on this initiative and then get to the resolution. Turn it a little bit different, so thank you for that. So we'll turn
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Turn to microphone number 3, please, to her patient Estella White from the BCAFN representative on the BC Aboriginal Justice Council.
Uklasish hinai chachi ist Estella White histakshi kashkriat nuchana kankwasta kumtmaas. Hello everyone, my name is Estella White. I'm from the Heshkwit First Nation, which is a tribe part of the Nuchana. First of all, I want to extend thanks Ushakshit Isk, Kleko, Tamasquium for allowing me to present here in their territory. I also want to recognize and acknowledge the chiefs, matriarchs, leaders, elders, and everybody who is here today. It's an honor and a privilege to speak to you. So I'm a lawyer, and I'm also, I've been appointed to the BC Aboriginal Justice Council, and I just want to share a little bit about who we are as a Justice Council and provide an update of what we've been up to. And I do actually have a PowerPoint. I guess if anybody's interested in seeing the PowerPoint, get in touch with me, and it will be easy for me to send a copy to you. So just by way of background, back in 2007, the Justice Council, oh, here we go.
And you got the clicker just right there, you go.
So a little bit of background about the vision. So back in 2007, the First Nations Leadership Council held a BC First Nations Summit. And after that summit, the BC First Nations Action Plan was created and actually endorsed by the leadership. And part of that action plan was the idea to support the concept of a representative and inclusive First Nations Justice Council to address province-wide justice issues. And so from there on out, leading up to now, between 2013 to 2015, with the help of the Native court workers and resolutions being passed at all of the organizational bodies of the First Nations Leadership Council, we were formed as an Aboriginal Justice Council. And basically the core vision here is, realizing that the justice system, mainly the criminal justice system and the child welfare system, we're not seeing positive outcomes. Our people are not seeing positive outcomes. And a key aim of the Justice Council is to address those issues. So again, I'm just going to touch on some contributing factors that led to the role of the Justice Council. As you can see, there are previous and existing provincial justice strategies, reports, recommendations have not addressed Indigenous justice issues. The most recent justice strategy, it's just most commonly called the Cowper Report, completely and intentionally excluded Indigenous justice issues. And as you can see, there's a quote that basically says, Indigenous issues are too complex, we couldn't consult, and so they didn't. So we are basically just completely left out of that. And another factor is, Gladue, that was a huge seminal case that came out of the Supreme Court of Canada in 1999. And what that case did was basically instructed courts and judges to take into account the circumstances of First Nations offenders and to consider out-of-court options as ways of responding to the offenses that were committed. And since that decision, what we've actually seen is sort of higher rates of incarceration levels at both federal and provincial levels. So as the slideshow said, the promises that were made in that decision and subsequent decisions have not been realized. And again, existing policies, practices, resource distribution for Indigenous people are just inadequate and inequitable. And I'm not going to go on with the stats. I think that we've all read enough reports. You know, the child welfare system and criminal justice system impacts our families and our communities. But there are statistics there. What I will note is that since 2007, you know, when the action plan was created, it sort of laid out, statistics. And back then, the report basically raised an alarm. These are concerning numbers. They're too high. There's too many children in the child welfare system. There's too many of our people in jails. And since then, it's only gotten worse for the most part. And so, as I mentioned, this is the Justice Council. We all volunteer our time. We don't get paid. And we basically became a council in 2015, and since then, we've been working really hard with what little resources we've had, and here are the members. You can hold us all accountable, but we all work on your behalf. So that's Haley Bruce, Christy Bell, myself, Chief Aaron Sam, Nancy Sandy, Colleen Spear, which she provides the Métis representation on the council, and ex-chief, Doug White. And as you can see, each political organization has appointed a member, and then the additional 3 representatives were jointly appointed. And so I've touched on this. The aim and our mandate as a council is to challenge approaches that contribute to the overrepresentation of Aboriginal children in the child welfare system and in the criminal justice system, and to engage, bring government to the table to advance effective strategies for making that better. And so that's what we've really been doing, is trying to create tables that don't exist. And a lot of the time we hear that there's no funding. So we're trying to bring key players to the table and trying to create more than pockets of money, and just trying to engage and advance these really important issues where we've had to create tables. And so basically that's what we've been trying to do, is the bullet point number 2, is to hold BC government accountable. And that's what we've been doing. And our latest initiatives, in the first sort of year of work, given that the mandate is so big, to address the issues that we face in 2 very large systems. So we spent a lot of time trying to prioritize what we can actually accomplish as a 7-member team. And what we did is we sort of split the council into two streams. And so we have a co-chair and 3 members on the criminal justice side, and then we have 4 on the child welfare side. And the chair on the criminal side is Doug White, and then we have Nancy Sandy on the child welfare side. And they both do an excellent job, and it enables us to be more effective. And so we have finalized our strategic plan to really prioritize some key wins and some actual objectives that we could achieve within a 3-4-year term. And so that's what we've done, and that's been finalized and presented to the Leadership Council. We've also co-chaired the Provincial Advisory Committee on Specialized Courts, and the aim here is really we know there is jurisdictional space within the current provincial court system, and so we're really trying to create and support nations and the opportunity for First Nations courts, family courts, and to provide more opportunity for nations to pursue justice in accordance with their own traditions and outside of what you consider the regular court system. And most recently, I'm forgetting one, we've also been in dialogue with the First Nations Health Council. There's a huge overlap in the health issues, mental health, trauma, FASD, there's a huge overlap between health issues and justice issues, and we're in talks with First Nations Health Authority, Health Council to see how we can work together to address those. And then most recently, last month, this is quite significant. We entered into an MOU with the province, and there you have the Minister of Public Safety and the Attorney General, and basically agreed to develop an Indigenous justice strategy. And part of the strategy will focus, and reconciliation is broad, but it's in there given that it links, the TRC calls to action, it links, UNJIP, and it sort of provides that, and it also sort of underpins Section 35 of the Constitution, what we understand as our constitutional rights and Aboriginal rights. So reconciliation is important to bring it all together. Decreasing the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the justice system, improving experience for Indigenous people within the justice system, addressing violence against Indigenous people, especially women and girls, improving access to culturally relevant justice services by Indigenous peoples, providing Indigenous peoples with flexible and user-focused services, and engagement with Indigenous communities and organizations in a respectful and culturally appropriate manner. So I know we are in the works with meeting with relevant ministers to go over this and to start bringing that forward. And that's going to be a big chunk of work that we have moving forward is to implement this MOU. And they've also sort of committed to a portion of money. The goal is that we can sort of create long-term funding for these types of issues, create permanent tables and a permanent forum to really move these issues forward and to see better outcomes in both the child welfare and criminal justice systems. And this is a positive first step, but there's a lot more to hold the government account for, and we hope to do that. And that's sort of the update on the Justice Council now. Yep.
Thank you so very much, Stella, for willing to be the last presentation on the agenda, taking us through some good work that you're doing with your fellow colleagues. We do have a token of appreciation for you. I think it goes quite well with what you're wearing. So with that, we're getting ready to close and bring an end to this annual general meeting. And I want to thank each and every one of you who are still here with us for your attendance, your persistence, and your support of these important dialogues that are here for you. And I also want to thank you as chair for the honor to serve you. So thank you very much. I lift my hands to you. And if any way I have offended you, I please ask that you forgive me. It was not my intent, but simply to fulfill this role. And so I wish you well, and I call forward at this time Alec Dan to bring us to a close in a good way. When he is done, we will have completed this assembly.
Wonderful to share all our songs that we have. Share with everyone to carry on with their day. And thank each and every one of you as well for, the encouragement myself, once again, honor for me to be here, represent my people. Well, I'll share a canoe journey song so you can make your way safe to your temporary home for these few days that you're here in Vancouver. And so with that, I'll share this canoe journey song. Haitap Kasiyam, Hait Kasiyam. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Just some housekeeping for the shuttle. It should be here at 5 o'clock. For tomorrow, if you're coming to attend the dialogue session on defining a new First Nation fiscal relationship with the Crown, there is no shuttle. Our gratitude goes to the Musqueam Nation for hosting, to the BCAFN staff and board and leadership for bringing us here. Thank you. Gukshan.